now I just gotta figure out how to, there we go. Okay. All right, so everybody can hear me and you can see my screen?
Yes.
All right, perfect. So I guess I'll get right after it. So this presentation, hopefully, I kind of stuffed a couple presentations I've done before all into one, which can work in some ways and not in others. I have your list of questions here. I think I'm going to pretty much be able to cover most of them through there. I would like to be able to answer a bunch of questions at the end, talk about beer, do all that kind of thing. So if this is a little quick, if you just wait to the end, or if you have some questions, like I said, I have your list of questions here. I'm going to try to finish in about, 25, 30 minutes. That way we get a good chance to talk about all the things you want to. Also, I'm going to drink Helles while we're doing this, because this is, lager beer, which is the, the main kind of lager beer. If you ask me, it's the best kind of lager beer. It's the definition of lager beer is Helles. So if you guys are drinking Helles,
yeah, actually, we've distributed the 3 beers that you sent out. So we have the slow pour, the Helles, and the Dunkel. And so it's a convenient point where you say, hey, let's all open up this one right here, and you want to say something about that beer. I'm assuming we should start with the Pils, right? And open that one up first.
I don't know. I think we'll probably open up Pils after the talk. To me, I would just drink Helles all during it. So I think we should all open up Helles right now.
All right.
And do it that way, personally.
You're the leader here, so we're gonna all open up our Helles.
Yeah, open up your Helles right now.
All right, got it open.
Yeah, so Helles is just lager beer. So this is the kind of beer when you're doing a mundane task, it's, for lack of a better term, lawnmower beer, I guess. So, all right, I'm gonna go ahead and start, guys. Brewing lager beer. So my name is Ashleigh. I'm the head brewer and co-owner of Bierstadt Lagerhaus in Denver, Colorado. Thank you guys so much for having me. I'm super pumped to be here. First page is just kind of a picture of my actual brew house, which is why I'm not good at technology, since it was built in 1932. Ooh, sorry, this is my wrong talk. Stop sharing. Sorry, guys. This is my other talk.
Well, while you're getting that talk up here, I didn't really get a chance to introduce you, but obviously you are the founder and head brewer at Bierstadt. And a couple of the other things that I like about Ashleigh is that she is she studied mathematics, and of course my father's a retired math professor, and she played Division I soccer, which is a kind of really small task there. So, and my favorite sport, really. So, real excited to have you out here to talk about some of these beers and what you're doing for lager brewing. We've been all excited about this for the whole month, and so this is a great opportunity for us to learn from an expert like yourself.
Oh, I'm super totally excited to be here. All right, this should maybe be it. Yeah, this should be it. Okay, sorry about that. Like I said, I'm really bad at the old technology here.
No problem.
It is not letting me share the screen that I have here.
By the way, this Helles is great. This is outstanding.
Sorry, technical difficulties. I don't know how to share the screen that I have.
If you're in Zoom, you go down to the.
I'm online though, and my screen is on my computer. It's not letting me pull that one. Hold on. Okay. Okay, I'll figure this out. 2 seconds. Sorry about that. I thought I had this all.
No problem.
I've been drinking a lot of Helles the last 6 months, and I want to echo everybody who said that this Helles is just right in the wheelhouse. It's really, really good. Nice job, Ashleigh.
Thank you. Let me see if I can email it to myself real quick and then get it pulled up on here. It's not letting me share from my actual computer. Yeah. It only wants to share what's online.
Yeah.
PC.
I think if you get it up on your screen, though, you should be able to, if it's on your computer.
It didn't do it. It opened a different PowerPoint, weirdly enough. my old Peru PowerPoint. So let's send that to myself. Send. Okay. Open with maybe Google Slides. And let's see if this works. If not, I'll talk off the cuff and I'll send you guys my PowerPoint afterwards.
Okay. This beer is just, I mean, it's just gorgeous. It's crystal clear. It's got a lot of bubbles to it, but not overly biting. And it's got a great everlasting head to it. Just clean as can be.
I didn't want to share my.
You could potentially email the slides to Andy too.
Oh yeah, you want to email them to me? I could post them up.
Yeah, I can probably do that. Sorry, like I'm not even joking with you. I can barely put together an email.
Send them to me, and then while I'm getting that, send it to me, and then while I'm getting it all up on the screen, you can tell everybody a little bit about this beer.
Cool, sounds great. All right, let's see. Compose to Andy Hamlin, and then all right, sent it to you just now. All right, yeah, so Helles is literally, you just go to Germany, they call it lager beer. I guess the best way I can describe it is it, toes the line between bland and sublime. Like it shouldn't blow your socks off the first time you drink it. It should be a slow and steady, getting to know this beer. And by your third one, realizing that you wouldn't change anything about it. And that is what I love most about, this style of beer and mostly German lagers in general. So I'm reading your guys' comments. I can see them.
All right, Andy, hurry up.
Working
Do you have a favorite lager house in Germany?
So I'm a big fan of Augustiner, but my favorite is probably Schönraumer, which is near the Austrian border, very much down south. I think their portfolio from top to bottom is excellent. Obviously, if you're talking big six, Augustiner, Helles, Augustiner Pils, Hofbräu Helles is a close second. And then if you've ever been up to the top of Ondex, drinking Doppelbock and eating Schweinhaxe, there's not anything better than that moment, to be fair. So those are kind of my favorites. There are some smaller producers. I went to Giesing this last year, a year ago, which was excellent. Although I don't recommend drinking their American style beers. If I want to drink American style beers, I'll drink them in America, I guess.
Yeah.
But it was a wonderful brew house, wonderful people, very cool because it wasn't necessarily as old as some of the other ones. But those are kind of my favorites. I see some call outs over there. Jaeger. I've never been up to Jaeger, but Jaeger Pils is one of my favorite beers on the planet. I love how snappy the bitterness is in that beer. And Augustiner Maximator, yeah. Fantastic.
Which brewery you said though? You said Schönraumer?
Yeah, Schönraumer. It's so Eric Topp, who's a good friend of mine. He actually grew up in Wyoming in Casper. I think it's Casper, no, Cheyenne. He grew up in Cheyenne and he went to school at the Colorado School of Mines, which is an engineering school. And he lives in Germany as actually the brewmaster at Schönraumer. He's lived in Germany for longer than he lived in the United States. And his parents still live in Cheyenne. So I see him quite frequently, but his pills, amazing. Helles, like so dry, so crisp, so clean. Dunkel, Hefeweizen, like you name it, I think his portfolio from top to bottom. And it's in the middle of actually nowhere, as it turns out.
Sometimes that's the best.
Cool, there you go. I think you got my slides now.
Yep.
Well, thank you. Sorry about that.
Yeah, no.
All right, I guess we'll start. If you just want to go to the first slide, the next slide. So this is a little bit about our brew house and a little bit about me. So I've been professionally brewing for about 10 years now. Bierstadt Lagerhaus, we are 100% lager brewery, so we don't make alt beer, no Kolsch, no Weiss beer, none of those things. While delicious, just we basically designed an entire brewery to make one style of beer. So as far as smaller breweries are concerned, or as far as like microbreweries are concerned, we have a lot of big equipment that we use in order to not use it that often, basically. So I like to think of it as like while we're a 38 hectoliter brewery or about a 35 barrel brewery, we're more like a 15 barrel ale house. So if you look at it in that terms, we also have 100 hectoliter tanks. So we brew 3 times in each tank. So we brew very big batches, basically once every 2 years. And we only make 3 beers all year round, which you guys, that's what I sent out there, is all the 3 beers we make constantly, which are pills, our slow pour pills, which is probably what we're most known for, our Helles, and then our Dunkel beer, which I don't drink that often, but I do think is underrated as far as our styles are concerned. So the pictures down there, the one on the left is our mash, our Lauterton, and the one on the right-hand side there is our mash kettle, actually. So it works as both. So it's actually where we mash our malt, our grist, and actually where we also boil as well. So if you want to go ahead and skip to the next slide, please. So some of the way I like to start this is we just want to talk about, what is the difference between ale and lager, right? Like, why would we even make a distinction? And honestly, when you think about it, these two things, ale and lager, can be very similar if you just think about them from a purely technical aspect. And when you think about them from, just like purely, like, look at these stats here. Like right now we're drinking a Helles, right? So my OG is 12.2 Platos, so that's like what, 1048 or so for homebrewers, which is very similar to any golden or blonde ale. Same with Final Gravity, same with IBU, same with SRM. Like these things are very similar, and the only thing that really separates them is the fact that one's an ale and one's a lager. Same with Dunkel. Compare that to a typical brown ale, which not many people drink anymore. So I guess maybe it's a moot comparison. But when you look at these two things, you see, like, actually, if you just look at their statistics, two things that are very, very similar to one another. And I think that's what, we're trying to draw the distinction between, like, why is it lager, why is it ale, etc. So if you'd skip to the next slide, please. So these are the things that I believe are the main differences between ale and lager. So we're talking ester profile. So we're talking everything, those fruit characters, banana, so isoamyl, or any apple, or any citric, or any, these yeast-derived flavor characteristics especially. When I think about lager beer, I basically think it's the absence of yeast character. So you really want to just let hops and malt shine. So really suppressing those esters. We also talk about sweetness and crispness. So think about the best blonde ale you ever had and the best like Helles you ever had. Definitely dryness versus sweetness is a big component of that, as well as esters. And then overall just drinkability. Because you are not getting a lot of the esters or a lot of these yeast characteristics, I believe there's an improved drinkability, or the ability to drink multiples of one type of style, So next slide, please. So these lager styles, right? So a lot of people want to say that there's only just a few, but you can really create a ton of different styles with just, like I said down there, like 5 malts and 2 varieties of hops. It doesn't seem like there's a lot, you know, and we kind of get stuck, and a lot of them are very similar to each other as far as statistics goes, but have a lot of difference in the actual, you know, flavors that they're giving off here. So the difference between a Maibach and a Helles, while their, you know, characteristics or grist, you know, makeup is very similar to one another, and hop makeup is very similar to one another, just that change in gravity, change in alcohol, the, you know, amount of hops creates an entirely different beer. And I think that's the best thing about, you know, when we're talking specifically about German style lagers, is that it's the simplicity and the ability to, you know, create vastly different beers based upon just like the same ingredients, and that they're very much technique driven. And I think that lager beer is very much technique driven.
So Ashleigh, do you follow that criteria, saying that you're going to just use only a few different malts and hops, or do you?
So we are basically a 3 malt, 2 hop, 1 yeast brewery, with the exception of some seasonals. So if I were making a smoke beer, obviously I'd need to bring some smoke malt in. If I were making like, I don't know, a Schwarzbier, or if I were making like Wiesen. But for the most part, it's pretty much Pilsner malt, Munich malt, and Vienna malt. There is some acidulated malts and like some darker malts to adjust for color, but like I don't really consider those like primary malts. You know, those are just malts to help you get where you're going, not really malts that contribute any like flavor characteristic. So we are 2 hops, which are Hallertau Mittelfrüh and Hallertau Tradition. And then we use 3470 as far as yeast goes. I have used a couple other yeast types on different beers as I deem necessary, but for the most part, like I said before, I think yeast is the absence of yeast character is really the crux of like making true lager beer. So choosing a yeast that works in your brewery is very, very important. So if you want to go to the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about malt selection. So malt selection, you know, I get the question frequently, actually usually not from homebrewers, to your great credit. I get this question a lot from professional brewers, is why can't you just use, you know, 2-row? And I give a lot of credit to the homebrew community for being very rigid in some ways about the way that they think about traditional beer. You know, it's not that they're not apt to do some crazy stuff, but they're less apt to take what I consider shortcuts. So there's a lot of reasons to use Pils Malt instead of just standard 2-row. Protein content, flavor, and I've not used a lot of like craft malting, so I can't speak very much to any experience on those. But you know, the Germans have been doing this for a long time. They're very good at what they do. It's not to say you can't make a excellent beer. I did use some Admiral malt, which is around your area, closer towards LA, in making a beer with Enegren, and it was quite wonderful. But I haven't had that experience necessarily with any other domestically malted malts. Talk about, you know, less modified and more modified malt. Honestly, there isn't that much difference these days. There's some small variables, but for the most part, unless you have the ability to get highly under-modified malt, they're all fairly modified to an extent where I don't think it makes a difference. And we talked a little bit about, when you're reading the style guidelines about DMS and malt, it's not acceptable in those styles at all. And I actually, as much Pilsner malt as I've ever used, I never get a large amount of DMS from those malts. So I do think using Pils malt over the standard 2-row, when you're making a traditional German style, like if you want to make some other kind of lager, you know, they might have it, you know, things that lend itself to it. But for the most part, I think Pils malt is made to be Pils malt for, you know, protein, flavor, how much shorter the kiln is, the color of it, etc.
So is this 100% Pils malt then?
So it is 96% Pils. The Helles or the Pils?
I guess the Helles, what we're drinking.
So the Helles and Pils are very similar to one another. I use so Pils is 96% Pils malt and 4% acid malt just to fix the pH. And Helles is 90, well, let's see, let's do math, 86% Pils malt, 10% Vienna, just for the color adjustment, just so it doesn't look too much like Pils, although I'm going to be honest with you, about 90% of the time it looks the exact same color. So it's just a habit, I suppose. And then the last 4% is acidulated malt to fix pH.
And then I don't get a lot of grainy flavors that I get sometimes with in a lot of Pilsners that are done with 100% Pils malt. Is there a reason for that, or is that, I mean, is that?
So I have a lot of different things that I think are the culprit of that kind of flavor you're talking about. Some of that is when I've seen it in domestic malt, only because it doesn't have the efficiency necessarily that imported malt does. A lot of times it is paying attention to, when you're running off this beer, especially lager, if you have the right efficiency and you know your brew house efficiency, you don't really ever want to take your last running. So anything under 10 12, 10 12, you want to just throw away. You're better off adding water, because what you're doing is that at 10 12 the pH spikes to 5.7 5.8, and what you're doing is extracting a lot of tannins. And that is a lot of the graininess that I think you get from a lot of like only Pils malt, is because it is a very efficient malt, but you do see those runnings drop quite a bit, and you don't need every bit of that sugar. I know it seems like you should take it, but it's best to just leave some of that behind.
Makes sense.
If you have the ability to monitor your pH, you can automatically know, as soon as that thing hits 5.7 or 5.8, your runnings hit 5.7 or 5.8, just go ahead and stop it. You're not really gaining that much more sugar. You're better off adding just straight water and then adjusting your pH with lactic acid or something, or phosphoric, to get your pre-boil target. So if you want to skip to the next slide. So when I think about like lager, we talked about it a couple of slides ago. We're talking about the simplicity of your malt bill. Like everybody wants to say, like, and especially as home brewers, because you have the ability to get malts in very much, small amounts. So you can get, 4 ounces of this and 5 ounces of that, and et cetera, et cetera. It doesn't mean for the sake of complexity that's necessarily a good call. It's always about simplicity. And the genius of German beer, German style beer, is the techniques. So you want to go like straight technique driven. So mashing and decoction, while maybe not necessary from a modification standpoint anymore, from a flavor standpoint, I do think it's very necessary. And as home brewers, you guys have a definite ability that most, honestly, even professional brewers don't have that ability. Small amounts of crystal caramel malt can be acceptable, but honestly, even things like carafoam, and I think it's hard to say where some of these things came from. It's something that everybody knows, right? That carafoam or carapils enhances head retention. But Charlie Bamforth, the king of like foam, has done studies, and those are actually foam negative malts, and they're not very fermentable. So what you're doing is creating a less dry beer by adding crystal and caramel malts. And when you do that, you're taking away some of the things that make lager beer, lager beer. So, if you have to have a small amount of that to adjust for color, my Meritzen, for example, does have about 1% Caramunic 2 just to get that wonderfully bright orange color. But for the most part, I don't believe that any sort of crystal caramel malt belongs at all in any beer, any lager beer. any German style lager beer, I should say. If you're talking Czech style lager, there is some a little bit of a difference there. So,
Ashleigh, are these decoction beers then? The ones?
yeah, every beer is decocted. So the Pilsner's single decoction, and everything else we make is double decocted. So we use a full mash schedule on every single beer. I don't do a lot of triple decoction only because I don't trust a couple of the temp probes in here, and really your window is, while large, you know, the brewer's window is fairly large. It can be small if you miss it too hard too many times. So I think a double decoction achieves everything in the saccharification rest, and then we do on the mash out for consistency. And just boiling the mash.
Are you using less modified malts, or are you just doing this purely just for flavor?
I mean, you can use slightly less modified malt, but like I said before, it's very hard to get anything significantly less modified. I do think it makes a difference, though. So if you've ever boiled your mash, you know that there's a change in the characteristics. So it's melanoidins. It's everything you love about toast, right? You get those caramel characteristics without adding caramel malt, which increases fermentability. You get like color as well. So you can pick up color without adding any extraneous malt. So it really helps keep your recipe very simple. And to me, I think the beer that benefits most from it is Helles. And Pilsner Urquell is triple decocted. It is that elusive malt character without sweetness that I really think pale beers even like very much benefit from. If you want to hit the next slide. So I will talk a little bit about water. I know there's a lot of water questions on here, but I'm going to be honest with you. I don't like playing with my water too much. We're happy here in Denver having very good water. Although recently they did up the pH of our water with sodium hydroxide from about between 7.8 and 8.2 to now our base is 8.8 to 9.2. So I actually had to install a lactic acid pump to make sure my water was more around the 7.8 range where it's been before. There is an idea to us in our brewery that we can import pretty much every other ingredient, but our water is part of who we are. It doesn't mean we don't add a little bit of calcium chloride to our pills, or if you were making a Dortmunder, you know, adding the salt so you really get that, you know, kind of like minerally bite to it. But I think it's really difficult to try and chase some of those variables around unless you have a really accurate water report all the time. So, you know, here's some basics down here, just like adding, you know, an additional, you know, 50 ppm in your calcium water. You know, you can either use calcium chloride or calcium sulfate, and you can either accentuate, you know, the body and sweetness, which is what we do with the pills, and the calcium sulfate can tend to accentuate a little bit more harsh bitterness, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. So we do try to just keep our calcium in range, but other than that, I don't really play with our water too much because I do think it's too much of a moving target unless you're doing it from RO all the time.
Is your base water a soft water to begin with, or do you, or is it, what does it look like before you start adding anything to it? What do you have?
So it's fairly hard right now. It used to be more soft. So that's partially the reason we do add a lactic acid to bring down the pH of the water. And then we just filter chlorine and chloramine out. Okay. But other than that, it's a pretty neutral water. It can make pretty much everything. Again, I will add a little bit of calcium chloride to accentuate the body of our pills and to kind of like dryness and body, all those things. And for the rest of it, I kind of just it's pretty neutral water. I don't feel the need to play too many games with it. Now, I have a friend who owns an English brewery who plays a lot of games with his water, with gypsum and all that kind of stuff, and has really good luck with it. But I'm not a big fan of changing your water too much when there's a lot of other variables that I think are are more important. Even I had a study recently where I was, they really tried to do these two things, calcium sulfate and calcium chloride. In Sierra Nevada, Crooked Stave, and a couple other breweries actually did a test with it. And it was amazing that you would think that they would have a big difference as far as palate goes, but not much, actually, when you think about mash water. There's a lot of buffers in there. It's really difficult unless it's really bonkers. And there's a lot of, chlorine is a big deal. But if you don't have those things in there, I don't know that it's worth chasing that down. Now, if you're super professional and you've done, you're looking for one more thing to do, I highly recommend it. But even on a professional scale, I really like what our water is. And so I don't feel the need to try and chase down something specific. Now, if I lived in like Plano, Texas, I might feel differently, or my friends in Indiana. So maybe that's just a product of being here in Denver. You want to hit the next slide? So we'll talk a little bit about hops, which is a big and small part. So this is actually the hop farm that we get our hops from in Bolsnack, Germany. Really amazing place. It's a small family-owned farm. If you want to hit the next slide. So I'll focus mainly on, the beers that I make all the time, which is German style lager. I think it's really important, noble varieties. Doesn't mean there's not any room to play around with these things, but if we're talking traditional beers, low alpha. If you're a home brewer right now, I highly suggest throwing out anything you have alpha over 8. Like, forget the Magnum, forget all of those things. That, I don't actually know where it came from, that those were considered bittering hops and the other ones were considered flavor hops. So one of my favorite books is The Textbook of Brewing from Jean de Clercq. And, well, Germans seem very, direct in the way they do everything and very mathematical and very, to the T. They do actually have this weird kind of fluffy language they use around bitterness and things like that. And we consider it the softness of bitterness. So when you use these high alpha hops, you're using, more of this bittering power, but less of the hop material. So hops are not just alpha acid, right? Hops are beta acid, there's a lot of different oils in there, there's all these different things that encompass in hops that aren't just alpha acid. And I think that when you purely use high alpha hops to bitter, what you're doing is robbing yourself up of these other wonderful acids. And it creates a more harsh bitterness. And so the Germans did this thing where they had 2 beers next to each other, the same IBUs, one with just high alpha hops and one with low alpha hops. And the difference between them was literally what they would consider, and I'm not joking you, a softness of bitterness. Like a bitterness that kind of like sweeps over the tongue. It's a textural thing instead of a bitterness that's very like right to the point. And so even when you're bittering these beers, and the beers that we are, we're making don't even take that many hops to begin with. So there's really not that incentive, in my opinion, to try and cut costs, I guess. So I think always adding low alpha hops. Like I love my middle fruits that are 4 alpha. That's an amazing thing. So also no late additions. And again, I'm talking very traditional. Like if you want to experiment, obviously do your thing. But if you want to talk purely traditional, there's really nothing past 20 minutes to the end of boil. With the exception of being Italian style pills, if you consider that a classic style, which I don't necessarily, but I know it's something people are very interested in making these days. And then again, don't make it too complex. 1 type of hop per beer and 1 to 3 additions, 3 being the maximum. Every one of my beers doesn't have more than 2 hop additions, and about half of them have 1. So I guess I'm averaging 1.5 hop additions for all of my beers in general. But just looking at the hops, really high quality hops. We don't use whole cone, very hard to deal with. We do use wonderful pelletized hops. Again, Hallertau Mittelfrüh, which I think has a distinct lemony citric characters. And then Hallertau Tradition, which I think is just a big Hallertau Mittelfrüh. So if you want to get to the next slide. So grist. So everybody thinks that you should just do one style of mashing. We're very thin, so lots of water to mash. So 4.5, 5 liters to kilos. I don't know what that is, honestly. I'll be honest, in pounds to, or gallons to pounds. But all things being equal, that thinner mash will be a more fermentable, higher attenuated beer, especially if you're going to do decoction. So if you want to go to the next slide. So it's probably a good time if you're ready to open up Dunkel, because we're talking about recipe formulation here. So my Dunkel only has 2 malts and a little bit of dark malt in it, only at Lauter. So it's actually pretty much 25% Pils malt. And then I use Barca Munich, which is somewhere between Munich 1 and Munich 2, for the rest of the 75%. And then Hallertau Tradition. That is a double decocted beer. So 2 decoctions and a 2-hour boil. So really trying to get those melanoidins, all those really wonderful dark characteristics without a lot of that sweetness. And so when you're thinking about these beers, all 3 of those beers, Doppelbock, Rauchbock, Dunkel, they're all actually fairly similar to one another. And again, we're just talking about technique. And if you look at the starting gravities of all of them, those are the main differences in there to make wildly different beers. So I think our Dunkel is very much like toast and toffee. You don't want any roastiness to it. You also don't necessarily want any like biscuit character, which I think a lot of people want to put biscuit malt and things like that in there. The idea that dark beer is heavy, I think, is a very outdated idea. I think you guys probably know that by now. Everybody calls Guinness heavy when it's like a 4% beer. So the idea that a dark beer is heavy, I think, is something that this beer explicitly goes right against. Close your eyes, and does this taste like a heavy beer to you? And it's definitely not. It should be explicitly dry, not a lot of caramel sweetness, no roast character, and no biscuit character to it. So next slide, please. Talk about light lagers. We did that a little bit. So adjusting for color, actually, it's a really good slide. I forgot this one was in there. But so in order to get that really wonderful dark color, which is almost a garnet, we use Carafa 3 Special, the dehusked. Actually, it's already milled for us. And what we do is we actually just throw a little bit of that in the lauter. We don't mash any of it, because if we mash that, we're going to get an astringent character to it. So we actually just use it to basically stain the mash. And you can adjust that accordingly. I use a little bit in Vienna in order to get that wonderful brown color. I use it in Doppelbock, and it's just a way to get the color that you want to without having to use Cinnamar and without having to use a lot of like crystal or caramel malt. I used quite a bit of it when we made a Czech style dark lager. I used a 5% by weight, and we didn't mash it at all. And it actually carried through in a very interesting, what I would consider a baking chocolate kind of cocoa character instead of a roasted character. But I do think it's a really cool way to change the color without actually changing the character of the beer. Next slide.
Where the fuck did you get this from?
Again, that's my recipes right there, exactly. So Pils is just, Pils and acidulated, and we're talking about hops. So the Pilsner, which we'll open at the end, but I want you to think about it a little bit, what you think a Pils should taste like. But we are just first wort hopping, which means we add 1/3 of the hop material that we're going to use, basically as we're running off. And then we add the rest of the hops for bittering at 70 minutes. And that's all the later the hop addition is. And I do think that that first wort hop character carries through until the end, and it actually does have a hop aroma without being whirlpool hopped, which I think is counterintuitive.
When you say you add that at 70 minutes, what can you clarify that? What does that mean?
70 minutes, so we boil for 90, so I'll add it 20 minutes into boil.
Okay.
At your guys' altitude, you probably don't need to boil for more than 60, but because we're at a higher altitude, all of those reactions take place slower. We only boil at 96 degrees instead of 100 degrees. So we do need to boil for longer. So if you make a soft-boiled egg here, it takes about 6 minutes. Whereas if you make a soft-boiled egg where you guys are, it's more like 4 minutes. So in order to drive off the DMS and everything, it does take a longer boil amount here.
For the Hellas, is the pill supposed to say 86%? Or is that?
Oh, yeah, probably. That's
Okay.
my old, sorry, funny old slide right there. Yes, you can do the math. So pills is the rest of it.
Gotcha. I want to make sure it wasn't like added on to something other. Or...
No. That's just me and my poor editing. Thank you. Ooh. All right, next slide. We'll talk about pH a little bit. Oh yes, a little more formula rep is the export and Maibach. Very similar beers again, but I just kind of like a play on all those different kind of hopping things. As you can see, I don't really add anything past 40 minutes. That's just a personal, that's my personal signature on beers. But I recommend, trying it out yourself. But these two beers are very, very similar to each other. One being a little bit extra, the 20, but honestly not a lot of difference between the two beers. You don't need the acidulated in the Helles Maibach because your runnings never get too low to really need it.
Ashleigh, are you brewing 100% lagers, or are there occasions where you brew an ale?
Nope, everything. 100% lagers.
Nice.
Mostly pills and Helles. I'm making pills tomorrow, so.
Okay.
So we'll talk a little about mashing and pH, I think, next. Yeah, so pH, really important. Using acidified malts, getting your mash between 5.2 and 5.5. You don't necessarily need to use acidified malts in anything above 16 Plato. Monitoring your beginning of boil pH and adjusting for pH. You would have to do a little bit math to figure out, this is my part of my professional talk, which is adding a food grade lactic acid to get a pH drop, but it's a really easy way to get a drop in there to get it to where you want to. So you do have to worry about when you're adjusting for pH in order to basically get what you want out of your hops, if you want a softer or a harsher hop character. Monitoring your last runnings, which we talked about earlier, and we talked about that graininess, and I think that is really a huge reason why a lot of beers do have that grainy characteristic to them. And then obviously at your end of boil and end of fermentation, you really want to see that pretty large drop in pH. So 4.2 to 4.4 on everything. Next slide. So we'll talk a little bit about mashing. We'll talk, hopefully I'll get time for some questions at the end here, and hopefully I'll have answered everything. But, when all things are equal, we talked about this, like lager is dryness. So your fermentability is your primary concern. In 62 to 68, 62 to 65 degrees C, dry and refreshing, low and long. So let that mash sit there for an hour if you can. If you can only do a single temperature infusion, pick your best temperature. 146 to 152. Edging on the lower end to 148 is probably your best bet for an hour. If you can only do one temperature, always go low and long. Next slide, please. If we're getting a little bit more, towards the professional thing, again, upward step mashing, and it is a very classic way to do these things. I like it because you can hit all these different steps. I also like it because I actually love making beer for a living. And so I'm not just done at like, one time and stop. Like I actually love the process of making beer. So, if I can give my beer the best ability, if I can give the yeast the best chance of creating amazing beer, I just give them the sugar water and they create the beer, then I want to do as best I can. George Fix, that's a pretty old school way to do it, is the 50, 60, 70. But unfortunately, towards that 50 degree, because of how modified our malts are, you're actually digging into some of your head retention proteins there. So I prefer more like a 55 or 131 degree first step. You can do a long acid rest, but it is very difficult to actually get that drop in pH with the acid rest unless you're doing it for a very long time. So I don't know that it's, I think it'd be cool to see if a home brewer, can do it, but sometimes you're talking about 8, 9, 10 hours before the acid rest is really efficient.
So you're using the acidulated malt to get you to the right pH primarily?
Yeah.
Okay. And then are you using this step mash on all of the lagers that you brew?
Yeah, so I use the step mash with the decoction. So I'll do 55, 62, 71, and then I'll do a mash off decoction at 76 to kind of seal my sugar profile. And as a professional, I think that's really important because I make a lot of the beers all the time. None of them are just one and done. So it's really important to have a consistency. And by doing a mash off, we really create that consistency by doing that. On a double decoction, I would go 55, 62, and then I would pull a decoction off and boil it, add it back to the main mash so that it rests, brings the rest up to 71. Let it rest there at 71. Then I'd pull off another decoction, boil that, add it back so it raises the whole temperature of the whole mash to a mash off from there, which is in the next slide. So you can see this is a very Hotchkiss, like this is a very classic way of doing mashing. I've picked my temperatures for very specific reasons based upon my malt profile, etc., based upon the things that I'm looking for. But this is a pretty basic guide to doing a decoction. And those steps being where you're actually doing the decoction, the little jagged lines, that's actually where you're pulling the decoction off. And that decoction is added back in order to bring your temperature up. So I do mine a little bit later, a little bit differently, but I think it's a pretty a good outline of where to start when you're doing a decoction. So next one. So again, we talked about decoction. We talked about the idea that it's not necessarily necessary. So what it does do is it does eliminate DMS. You're actually doing some boiling beforehand, so you're driving off those precursors for DMS at the beginning. The melanoidins, those Maillard reactions, everything you love about toast. Creating dark characters without actually having to add any dark malts to it. It does help with attenuation in body. When you're looking at something like a double decoction and you have your alphas and your betas. So your alphas acts, your sugar protein or your sugar chains in half, and your betas bite at the ends. So if you can have both those working simultaneously, you're taking these very long sugar chains and you're creating a much smaller, which is much easier for the yeast to consume and turn into alcohol. There is some idea, and I know there was a question in here about low DO mashing. I don't believe in it at all. And I know it's kind of a big thing out there at the moment, and I know Kunza is a big believer in it. But as far as I'm concerned, the beers that I make should be drank super fresh, and you shouldn't have to worry about those type of possibilities, the thermal stress, the Strecker aldehydes, etc. If you're planning on consuming those beers within, 1 to 4 months, the Germans really put a lot of effort into this low DO, mashing. And tell me the last time you were able to buy a German beer off the shelf and it tasted anything like what it, it tasted like a shadow of itself. So despite all of these research and all of the things that they're trying to do to eliminate, this oxidation from the beginning, the beers are really not very good a year later. Beer should not have a year shelf life. The lager beer should not have a year shelf life. So I think it's useless, especially when there's a lot more that can happen on the cold side. And like I said before, I love making beer. I love a decoction. I love spending 4 hours here in the morning doing a decoction, drinking my coffee, like really taking my time to make the beer and put kind of my signature on it.
Actually, on the beers that I've done decoction for, I've noticed that I get a higher extraction rate on it. Is that your experience as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so what you're doing is you're thinning out the mash. So when you raise the temperature, you're doing something by like thinning out the mash a little bit. So a lot of your enzymes are tied up in the liquid. And so you're creating more. So the difference between that and like English ale, for example, which is like a very dry mash, is that there's just more of those enzymes working for a longer period of time. Also, if you're doing like a double decoction, what you're doing is breaking down those chains. And so you're going to get more fermentability
That's
through
what
all
I
those
thought was
things.
happening. I thought because I'm boiling the grains, I'm breaking them open. I'm making them more accessible. The starch is more accessible to the enzymes.
There's definitely a little bit of that going on for sure. So we'll talk a little bit about yeast selection. Again, I don't know that so it's the next slide. I'm a big dead set on 3470, but that's what works for me in my brewery. I've used Augustiner Ondex. I know there's some numbers for that. I don't know them off my top of my head. I thought I put my homebrew slide in here, but I did not. So maybe I'll send you my updated yeast selection slide. But basically, you should choose what works for you. If you don't have the ability to get very cold, some of these other yeasts are better for that. Again, we're looking for just like the absence of yeast character. And what are you looking for? Does that yeast make the kind of beer you're trying to make? I think, and I'm being perfectly honest, a lot of people put a lot of effort into choosing their lager yeast strain, and I don't know that it necessarily matters or should matter. However, I say that, but I do think it's necessary if you're making a Czech beer to use Czech yeast, because it is less attenuative and it does leave behind some more sugars. So it is a more satiating beer. So in order to make a true Czech beer, I do think you need to use a Czech yeast.
Are those the fermentation temperatures that you use then?
So I ferment at 47 degrees Fahrenheit. So very, very cold.
Okay.
So next slide, I have a fermentation schedule coming
Okay.
up. So there was a question about sulfur. So I believe that a German lager isn't a German style lager without some sulfur. And I mean that it should have the slightest bit of struck match, that flinty character, like that kind of dissipates instantaneously. Now, if you get a lot of like eggy sulfur, you probably have some unhealthy yeast and probably a bad fermentation, but it should have some sulfur. The colder you ferment, the more of that sulfur is going to be apparent. But the warmer, the more you're going to drive that off. So it is, the only way you can get out is to scrub it mechanically. Also, that sulfur dioxide is a natural preservative. So a little bit more sulfur is going to create make sure your beer doesn't age quite as fast. Next slide. Yeast pitching. So under pitching and over pitching. I think this is a big deal when it comes to homebrewers, is the under pitching. Always make a starter, like a huge starter. Most of you guys are not harvesting and pitching again, so you don't really need to worry about over pitching. I find that over pitching only has a problem in subsequent generations. So not in the first generation, but the ones after that. So always make a huge starter, always bitch more than you think you need to, and it creates for a really healthy fermentation. Next slide, please. So this is my ideal basically fermentation for Helles. You have Plato in the gray, So it starts at about 12, and you can see it declines fairly rapidly, and the number of days is on the bottom. So you can see I'm not reaching full terminal until about 20 days down there, which seems like a long time. But the beauty about lager yeast is that if you treat it properly and take the temperature down very, very slowly, what happens is the yeast can actually keep working all the way down to 0 degrees Celsius, which is the wonderful thing about lager yeast. It's one of the only yeasts besides Cal Ale that can ferment trisaccharides. So giving your yeast pitching enough healthy yeast and giving it a long amount of time to ferment is the most ideal way to make lager beer to me. Next slide, please. So let's talk quickly about primary fermentation. Basically, we're looking at 8 to 12 days. If you're taking longer than that, you should turn your temperature up. If you're taking shorter than that, you should turn your temperature down. This is an ale. You should not expect to see crazy fermentation. You shouldn't expect to see bubbles right away. You want to see a lag phase. You want to see that thing slowly take off. All your esters are created in the first 12 hours. So you really want to ensure that like your fermentation takes off smoothly and slowly. Next slide, please. Secondary fermentation. Oh, this is a picture of my cellar. It's very pretty. Next one. So secondary fermentation. So if I were a home brewer, what I would do is do my primary fermentation in a carboy, and around that 12 day, I would rack it into a corny keg, and I'd cap it there. And I would keep it for primary fermentation for another 10 days, and then I would start turning it down slowly if possible. And I would cap it there. You don't need a diacetyl rest if you ferment cold enough. So yeast at colder temperatures creates less of the precursor for diacetyl, so less of the alpha-ketolactate. So there actually is no reason for a diacetyl rest. The only reason to ever do a diacetyl rest, in my opinion, is to put a beer out faster. And if you're going to repitch the yeast, you especially don't want to do a diacetyl rest because it trains your yeast to work differently. It creates, more mellow palate. The yeast does its own job at its own time without being kind of roused quickly, and it is, I just think it's softer on the yeast, and you want to really give them the best environment to thrive, not freak them out too much. So when you're near, terminal gravity, I turn my beer down, 1 degree C per day. I let it kind of rest at 40 degrees Fahrenheit for a week, and that's kind of my diacetyl rest. And I leave it there for a while, and then I continue to turn down the beer until it's 0. So all start to finish for me is 10 weeks. So 2 weeks of primary, and then secondary fermentation / lagering is 8 weeks.
Wow.
On every beer. Yeah. Next slide. I think I only have a couple more slides left. We're talking about lagering. So to store just means to store. People get really hung up on just storing their beer cold for a long time after they've done a diacetyl rest. I don't know that improves the beer any unless you're just trying to clarify it. But if you're truly trying to make lager, turning it down very slowly and allowing it to mature naturally instead of forcing it to mature is going to make for the softest, cleanest beer possible. And you guys probably don't much deal with filtration and things like that. So allowing that yeast to precipitate out naturally is the kindest way to treat your beer.
Actually, one of the things that I noticed with decoction beers that I did was that they seem to come out clearer. I didn't have as much haziness or anything like that in the beers. I'm wondering if you obviously don't filter. When you go into the lagering stage, do your beers need to benefit from clarification, or are you lagering for other purposes?
Again, over time, that yeast, when I think I've taken my final gravity, even 3 weeks later, I've gotten much lower. So you're actually allowing it to continue to work It's kind of like just slowly and steadily working until you filter it out. It's still going basically. We do filter everything like to within an inch of its life. I love very bright beer. It is just a personal preference. But it is basically bright when it goes into a filter, and all I'm really filtering out is chill haze.
Okay.
Let's see, where are we at? I think we're pretty much at the end there. There's just a couple, I think it's just some of my sources and stuff like that. And then I know we're kind of at the end of time, but I'm happy to answer questions. And I know you guys have a social hour or whatever, but I'm here for as long as you guys want me to be.
We definitely are going to want you to talk about that, the pills when we get.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I think I got one sitting right here. Hold on. I got a bucket of beer next to me. How cool am I? Sitting next to front of my brew house.
That's very cool. We wish that we could be there with you.
Yeah, I should have sent some glassware with you. I was, see, you got one there though, huh?
I got a,
yeah. So pills to me pills should be the finest, most delicate beer. There's nowhere to hide in this beer, which I think is most lager beers, but especially this beer. It's the fine balance between the malt character and what I think is kind of a dusty hop aroma. So even though we only had odd hops at first wort in 70 minutes, I do think you get that really soft, lemony character. Hops are just bitter enough that they should dry the palate and make you want to take another sip. It's like salt, right? So if you salt something just enough, it makes you just thirsty enough or just want to take another bite more. And that's how we think about this beer. It's a very delicate example of all those things. So it's basically a one malt, one hop beer. Your original, I think the kids call it a smash beer, even though there's a little acidulated in there. We'll allow that to cheat. But just Hallertau Middle Brew and Pilsner malt, basically.
How do the hop differ from the Helles to the Pilsner?
So the hops in Helles, I think of that beer as the hops are just there to balance the malt character. So you shouldn't really be able to necessarily taste them, and you shouldn't necessarily be able to smell them per se. But what you should be able to do is it should be just enough hop character to pull you off the edge of it being sweet. Whereas I think Pils is a much more hop-forward beer. A little bit more bitter bite, a little bit more snappy, a little bit more dry, and less body.
So we should open this up for questions. What questions do you guys all have about for Ashleigh?
Before we get questions, Ashleigh, this is Ryan. I just want to say we really, really appreciate you joining us tonight for our meeting and sending out this beer. It's been amazing. I'm sure all the members, we've had a lot of good lager brewers in this club already, so I hope they further step up their game and get closer to your lagers going forward. I'm putting the pressure on everyone.
Yeah.
Yeah, my email's on the next slide, so feel free to email me. Sometimes I can be pretty slow just because I'm real bad with technology, as we already witnessed today. But I will eventually get back to you, and I'm happy to answer any questions, if you need clarification on anything as well. And I'm really happy that I was able to send out beer, and thank you for picking it up at Bagby. They're really good friends of mine, so it was an excuse to send out beer to them as well.
Yeah, and if anything, people will be stopping in when they visit Denver for sure going forward, I'm sure.
Fantastic.
Based on the comments I've seen, everyone's like, oh, this is like the best Dunkel I've ever had, all that kind of stuff. So really, really appreciate it. It's been amazing. I haven't been out to Denver, I don't think, maybe since the year you opened, and I wasn't familiar with the brewery at the time. So getting more, if you can send more beer out to Bagby, we'll definitely be going there to visit to drink it. That's for sure.
Well, put it
Okay.
this way. If you send beer out to Bagby, let us know so that we know it's there, so we can get our members down there. That's I think these are some. I think it's great that you've dedicated your craft to doing lagers and really trying to perfect this beer styles in the kind of the German and Czech lager styles.
Thank you.
Oh, I also want to mention
Ashleigh,
Oh, sorry. Just one
go
last
ahead,
thing. We made sure we kept the beer as cold as possible the whole time. At Andy's house, right in front of his garage, he has a bunch of coolers that he changes out ice packs every day. So we kept everything super cold for giving your beer, the best shot at being fresh and minimizing those temperature swings.
Yeah, and if you're paying attention, we also were sanitize all the coolers and everything, so it's a safe way for people to exchange beers. But yeah, the 48 sets of beers we sent out, that went out to 48 different people that were all here on this call. So yeah, we really are making the most of having this opportunity here with you.
Oh, fantastic. I'm super happy about that. It's meant to be drank,
Mm-hmm. So
hey, Ashleigh, this is Jack Ridley from Northern California. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you as well.
And I'm looking at this slide that shows your 3 beers lined up, and I was asking, where do you buy the foam head that you add to your beers in these glasses?
I buy them from a Czech faucet that is very expensive. So I love dispensing beer. I think it's a very I love beer. Like, beer is so amazing. And I think that a lot of times, unfortunately, a lot of places fall down at the last minute. You took everything. You painstakingly thought about what hops to use, what malt, and how to fix your water, and all these things. And then at the last moment, you serve it in a dirty shaker pint. So I think that the last and maybe most underrated portion of having an excellent beer experience is the presentation. I think, unfortunately, in the United States, it's one of the only places you can get a pour beer experience. If you go to even, I was in Australia a few years ago, and serving, like, excuse my language, shitbagger Coopers, but like on a Cobra faucet with like beautiful, wonderful dense foam. And so I think a little bit more of that idea that you care about it from start to finish is really important. And that's how we serve our beers here. Like, that is not a vanity shot. Like, usually the Helles maybe has a little less foam than that, but that's not a vanity shot. That's actually how we serve our beers every time. And I think it's part of the experience of drinking the beers. And on the side of each label, you can see, like, we really care about the presentation. Each beer has its own glass, and just the idea of what happens the very last minute. You can really screw it up. The closer you get to serving, the more you can mess it up, basically. Like brew day, you can't really mess it up that hard, but every step closer to where you serve it, including service, and including something as simple, which I don't think people think about it, is carbonic acid, and the way carbonic acid plays in with the sweet and malty and hoppy characters. If it's too much, in a Dunkel, I think it really upsets the character of a Dunkel. It makes it too prickly. But in like a Pils, I think the higher carbonic acid in there really lends itself to delivering the wonderful hop snappiness that beer needs. Same with like a Saison or a Hefeweizen, which are very highly carbonated beers, unlike maybe a stout, which would be detrimental if it were too carbonated. So all of these things really go into each layer of the beer.
Well, it's absolutely beautiful, and that's authentic. And I didn't get a chance to go by the exchange because I'm 600 miles north of the exchange.
Sorry, Jack.
To get your beers. But can I go to Colorado instead and visit you?
Absolutely, anytime. I'm pretty much open. You can always email me if any of you guys are ever in town. I live a 3-minute walk from the brewery, so.
Great, I'm gonna take you up on it.
It's my living room you're in. You're welcome.
A great living room.
More questions for Ashleigh.
Oh, sorry, Andy. I was gonna say for kind of a novice lager brewer, I brew a lot of ales and stuff, but for for lagers, I don't really do them too much. And I was just wondering, I don't want to minimize it, but like, is there something in particular that you feel is a key, like one key aspect you look for that you'd say makes or breaks your lager, or that's the way to crystallize?
Yeah, I mean that's a good question. I think so. The way I do think about our beer is that you can't do one thing 100% better. It's 100 things 1% better that contribute to the beer. But if I were to pick like one main thing, it's fermentation. So even just having the ability, even if you can't step it down slowly or whatever, being able to ferment under 52 degrees is going to automatically, and give it the time that it needs, is going to be the biggest, like, most important thing of all of it. Recipe is important, but if you have a garbage fermentation, it's going to show. If you have a great fermentation and a bad recipe, like, it's going to show, but it's going to show less. So really, if you can pick one thing, is really trying to get your ferment under 52 degrees Fahrenheit. And even if you have to keep it there for 4 weeks before you crash it, then, thumbs up. Even if you have to keep it there till you crash it, that would be the main takeaway that I would go with.
Cool, that's awesome.
Hi, Ashleigh. This is Bob McKay, and I'm zooming in from Cape Cod this evening.
Wow.
Howdy.
So I had a couple questions regarding carbonation. Do you use a spunding valve at all for natural carbonation, or do you force carbonate everything, or do you bottle condition?
So we absolutely spooned everything. So spooning is just at that certain point when it's still fermenting, but the sulfur character is kind of at an appropriate level, we'll go ahead and close off the tank, and instead of that CO2 venting to the atmosphere, it gets reabsorbed into the beer. So we absolutely do that. However, we are not quite as big as we're not quite brewing as much as you would need to fully 100% naturally carbonate. So I would never consider ourselves a Reinheitsgebot brewery. So I do have to touch up carbonation with a carb stone at the end. There has been a few occasions when I haven't had to do that. If we were fermenting, or if we were making a little bit more beer than we are now, I would use krausening. So that's taking a small percentage, about 10% of a beer at high krausen. So when it's really hitting its stride in fermentation, and adding that to a beer that's basically finished, and that would really amp the carbonation up and really make full use of the spooning valve. But we do get about 80% to 85% of the carbonation from the natural CO2 that's off-gassed by the beer.
And how at what time during the fermentation cycle do you add the spooning valve?
So I think that the best, like a rule of thumb type thing, and you should constantly be smelling and tasting your beer, because it can happen a day or two sooner or a day or two later based upon how it smells. But a good rule of thumb is about a Plato, or like, can't do the math for, you might have to do it yourself, but above terminal. So if that beer is a 1048 beer and it's going to finish at 1004, putting it a spooning valve on it at 1008 is probably about where you're going to want to do that. That's about the right amount of CO2 in it. Again, that can happen a day before that or a day later, depending on the sulfur character, because once you cap that up, that's all going to stay in the beer. So you have to be happy with the way it smells.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Ashleigh, what do your beers finish at?
Our Pils starts at 11.7 and finishes right under 2. Helles starts at 12.2 and finishes at 1.6. It's actually a drier beer on attenuation than Pils is, but because of the hop character, the carbonation, the Pils always feels a slight bit drier. And then Dunkel, our Dunkel's probably a little bit too big. It's actually a little bit out of the style category at 14 Plato. But because we make a lot of beers in the same category, I like it a little bigger. But it does finish about 2.5. So they're all very, very dry beers.
Hi, Ashley. This is Lauren. I first of all want to say thank you so much for presenting tonight and for making sure that we could all share in your wonderful lagers. It's been just a great evening. I was wondering, kind of a silly question. How long is a brew day when you're doing a double decoction Helles?
So it's a complex answer a little bit because it's not just a single brew day. We do 3 at a time. So it's me and just one other person, me and my partner, Bill. We start at about 6 o'clock in the morning and finish the next day at about noon. So I go straight back to back to back. So when I start tomorrow Pils, I'll start about 7 because of where it lands in the day. And I will be done the next day at about 11:30 noon in the afternoon. And that is partially because of the decoctions. So our decoction procedure takes approximately, for a double decoction, 3.5 hours or so. So we decoct it, we'll put it up in the lauter, we'll start running off, and we'll start boiling. From the boil, we'll move it to a whirlpool, which is a separate vessel. And as soon as that beer is in the whirlpool, or that wort is in the whirlpool, we'll start mashing it again. So we, you know what I mean, we're able to stack them on top of each other, and it's less cleaning at the end. But we only brew about once every 2 weeks. Right now, because of COVID and I'm doing some catch up, we're brewing about once every week. But it is about a 28-hour adventure every time we brew. But it's just kind of normal now.
So do
I
you?
get plenty of
That's quite different from an ale brew day somehow. I think that might be a little bit different.
I'm wondering, do you take turns sleeping, or how does that work between?
Yeah, we've gotten a little bit better. We used to not be great at it. We used to all be here at the same time. The morning's very busy. I'll come in here and basically start in the cellar, getting the heat exchanger and getting the fermentation and getting the flotation tank ready, while Bill mashes in and does that stuff, and I'll harvest and pitch yeast. And then by the time we're done boiling, he'll have gone home for a minute, and I'll take over, and then I'll mash in the next 2 batches. And I'll go home about 1 or 2 in the morning and get back about 6 or 7, and he'll get back home at 5 in the morning and not go back. So we have kind of like a system anymore, but I do have a hammock, so. I do live a 3-minute walk away, so that's part of, you know.
I feel so lucky to be drinking these beers. That is so amazing.
Yeah, you feel the 28 hours in brew process in this.
That's good. I like to hear that. We're like a duck, you know. All the work happens underneath, and it's smooth on top.
So you have a mash boil kettle, correct? So where are you staging the main mash when you're concocting or cooking the decoction anyway?
Yeah, so what we do is actually, so in our mash kettle, we'll actually remove 2/3 of it and leave 1/3 behind. So we'll remove 2/3 of it. We'll actually go up to the lauter, which is right behind me up here somewhere. There it is. I think there it is. Anyways, there it is. Yeah. So we'll actually move it up to the lauter, and then I'll boil what's in the kettle, and then I'll move the mash all the way up and let it rest up top in the lauter, and then I'll take 1/3 back down and boil that, and then move it all back up.
I'm curious because as a home brewer, it's easy for me to decoct and pull mash out, but how do you do this on a big system? I mean, is this all manual that you do this, or do you have a way to we have a bunch
of pumps and things like that. So this brew house was made in 1932. It came from a town called Almendorf, which is about 18 kilometers southwest of Nuremberg. So this guy behind me is all copper and very, very old. So it was meant to do it. But that's how they've done it forever. And we use a very high liquor to grist ratio, which allows the mash to be pumped. And we use a very specialized pump that's a low shear, super low shear pump, a positive displacement pump that allows us to pump the mash without actually beating it up too much. So there's some like specialty equipment, of course, that we use, but our brew house was designed to do just that.
So German engineering is what you're telling me.
Yes, 1932, man. Yeah. Still working.
Okay, sounds great. More questions?
I have another question. So have you? It sounds like you don't use horizontal lagering tanks.
We do.
At Bierstadt.
We do.
Oh, you do? Okay.
Yeah. We have a primary fermentation in very tall, skinny kind of, they're not cylinder conicals, which is what you've seen in every other brewery. And then we have horizontal tanks, which are about a 1-to-1 aspect ratio. It would be better if they're more like a 2-to-1, but because of the space, they're a 1-to-1. So we actually move them out of the primary fermentation at about 14 days. I would more like 12, but I don't work on Sundays. So it's 14 days here. And then they stay in the horizontal lagering tanks for about 8 weeks.
So what kind of differences do you see using a horizontal tank versus like a conical, a regular conical? Like,
so
is
yeast
it?
Go ahead, continue.
I was going to say, is it just a matter of finding, like, it's a shorter distance for particulates to fall out, or is there actually like a different ester profile or other flavor changes? I'm just curious.
So you hit on it a little bit. Yeah, you hit on it a little bit. Yeast love a change of scenery. And so when you move it to a horizontal lagering tank, it is less of a distance for the yeast to fall. Also, the way that they're shaped, a little bit more pressure on them. So a lot of the tanks in Germany, the primary fermentation tanks, are actually not equipped to handle over 1/3 of a bar, so about 5 psi pressure. So we move them into the horizontal lagering tank, which are built in a slightly different way to be able to withstand a little bit more pressure. And basically with that yeast falling, it still allows us from activity to happen, but also for when it falls in a very wide area and doesn't just build up in one spot. Because lager yeast isn't very flocculent to begin with. So it does allow it to flocculate out a little bit better.
Interesting. Thank you.
And every beer goes through like you said, every time you'll go into the horizontals after the primary.
Absolutely, every time, yeah. And when I send a final presentation over, probably the next day or so, I'll include a picture of our lager tanks and things like that in there.
What about Ashleigh? That you sent over these new beers in cans. I think this is the first time you canned, correct? Did you?
Yeah, I mean, we've been canning for about 2-3 months now, but we never bottled before that. Only cans recently because of COVID, just to be able to put out more. We were a strictly draft market before, like I said, about a couple months ago. So canning's new and exciting, I guess.
The cans came out great. I mean, the just the carbonation, the freshness of it all just really shone through. Really nice.
I think so as well. I'm actually really pleased with them. I do hate canning, but I love having beer in cans, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, I know exactly what you mean.
I'm just like, yeah, there's a can in my fridge right now. I'll just drink it. Like, it's very much not a normal thing, but yeah, I mean, it's difficult, but I am pleased with the beer that we have in a can, and I'm glad that it tastes similar to what we have on draft, which is always my biggest concern, getting the carbonation right. We actually have to carbonate the beer more in order to put it in a can, because when you're during the canning process, you lose a percentage of carbonation.
Yeah.
So when we do draft and can, we actually have to take into account carbonation for both those things.
We do the same thing when we're bottling beers. You have to account for the loss that you're going to get.
Do you guys buy a canning line, or do you have like a contract thing with some?
So there's a mobile canner that comes around. They do a really wonderful job. They're very professional. They take dissolved oxygen numbers and things like that. So I feel very good about what we're doing there. We are currently working with a company to try and design a canning line. So they've come with their not quite mobile canner, but it's mobile because it doesn't live here. to try and figure out if this is the canning machine we want to buy eventually, because it is a big expense in order to do that. Because unfortunately, like I said, due to COVID, I do think we're going to be canning for the next couple of years. Unfortunately, although the moment I don't have to can, I will stop canning.
Please don't, because
I was gonna say, I was like, hopefully that's one thing that's here to stay.
Whoa, don't do it.
But if you don't have to but if you don't have to, I could see, being on site is a good way to be.
There's only 2 of us, like it's me and one other person who run this whole brewery. So
we'll send Chris out there to can for you so that we can get stuff out here on the West Coast.
Just make sure you keep sending it to Bagby at least, because then we can
Oh,
try
I
it.
will. Really good friends of mine, and I do have a liquor license, like I said, in California. So I've sent beer out to Rare Barrel and to a few other places out there, just 1 keg here and there. So it's not outside the realm of possibility.
Okay, but anything you send out to Bagby, you should let us know so we can go, figure out when it's.
I will definitely be sure to let you know. I promise that.
Yeah. More questions? Any more questions?
Yeah, hey, Ashley, I got one for you. So when you're pitching your yeast, like as homebrewers, if we do a starter the night before and then we pitch after 24 hours, that yeast is at room temperature. Are you pitching your yeast at lagering temperatures?
Yes, very much so. So what I would say, you are slightly disadvantaged, but all first generation yeast, which is what we call that. Some people call that generation 0, just depends, which is basically lab grown yeast. I do get lab grown yeast quite frequently, and I do pitch the right amount right away. I don't try to grow it up myself. You are basically pitching kind of for lack of a better term, a really stupid yeast. Like it doesn't know how to exist in that arena. So whatever you would normally even if I ferment everything at 47 degrees Fahrenheit, I would take my first generation yeast and probably ferment it at 49, so just a little bit warmer, but I would still do it super cold. And you might see a lot longer lag time, but that's not a big deal. As long as you're seeing bubbles and as long as it's cold, you really don't have to worry about too much bacteria and things of that nature, if you know what I mean.
I was gonna say, if you're making a yeast starter for lagers, then do you also make it at the lagering temperature, 47, when you're doing a starter?
Can't really. It's definitely difficult. I would make your starter the same way you normally do. If you want some advice on how to make a lager a lager yeast starter, email me. I have a really good friend named Bob Hall, who's maybe one of the best homebrewers I've ever met, him and I have been working together, and we do have designs to put out a book together in the next maybe year or so. We're still working on that, where he does all the things I tell him to, but in a homebrewer setting, and we see if it works. So, but he's really, he always makes them at room temperature. I don't have a lot of experience doing that. So unfortunately, I can't give you a lot of advice on that specifically.
Ashley, do you feel like the lagers that you make with the stupid yeast are inferior to the lagers that you make with your 2nd generation or 3rd generation yeast?
So I wouldn't consider them inferior necessarily, but I would tell you that I always make 1st generation Helles. I never make 1st generation Pils. Because I do think it's enough of a difference that in a Helles, a very malty beer, that it can be overcome, because it does finish slightly higher and the color is always slightly darker because of the yeast media that it's grown in, the media that the yeast is grown in, that the beer is slightly different, which is, I just don't make 1st generation Pils. And I always like the later generations of beer. I don't find them inferior necessarily, but I always know when I have a later generation, I just like it more, if that makes sense. You're like, oh, what do I love so much about this Helles? The Helles that you have right now in the can is excellent, but the one that we just canned yesterday is just 4% more excellent, because I know, and maybe because it's a little bit paler, and so you know a lot of tasting happens between your ears, obviously, but it's just a slightly paler beer, a slightly drier beer, so I always think that I like it more. But the one in the can right now that you guys have is the one I'm drinking, and it's great. So I don't know why I always think the new one is the better one.
Imagine a Helles better than one that I had today. I mean, that was just amazing.
I taste for a living, so it's just I'm adamant that the newest one is just the better one always.
How it goes.
I know there was a question on here that I did want to address on the list here. That was if you guys have time, the other beers, like the other, where is it? Let's see, home with scale. Sorry, second page. There was something about like different kinds of lager outside. Like, is there any interesting different lagers that we've made here outside of the traditional things? And there's been a couple ones that we've done. I like to think of myself as hopefully an expert on lager yeast. And that to me means trying some things outside the box a little bit that don't necessarily compete with the kind of beers that we make. So I always want to use the techniques that we've perfected, but I also want to what to do with different ingredients. So in May, we made a corn lager where I used 400 pounds of heirloom Oaxacan whole corn that we ground ourselves with a significant quantity of 6-row and a little bit of Pils malt using our lager yeast and all the traditional lager techniques that we do. And I thought it was really interesting. Turned out it was a very cool beer. We also took a beer that we call BFL, Big Fucking Lager. That's literally its name. That we did like what's called a reiterative mash, where we mashed in basically our Märzen and then used the Märzen wort to mash in another Märzen on top of it. So we actually used the Märzen wort as the mash water. We made a 12% lager with no enzymes, no sugar, no anything, where we pitched enough healthy yeast and we didn't use anything extraneous, and we're still able to make a 12% beer. So I do think lager has a much larger range than people give it credit for. I've also made a steam beer with our lager yeast, which turned out really excellent as well. So I don't think lager is necessarily one thing in particular. I do like focusing on the classic styles, but it doesn't mean there isn't room for a little bit of play in there.
You did the yeast, so that was still 3740 for the BFL?
Yep, 470 for everything. Yep, absolutely.
I've got one question about fermentation temperatures.
Yes, sir.
In more recent times, there's been all this experimentation with like pitching cold, but then kind of ramping up quickly, this kind of fast lager method. And I was wondering what your thoughts were on that, and if that is just, if it's a no-go, or if there's some merit to it.
So I will preface this with, I think you should make the beer you like. So if you like the way the beer tastes when you do that, you should do that. I don't necessarily believe it's true to the lager style if you're trying to be traditional, but if you're not trying to be traditional, I totally get it. I find that a lot of people do that just for the sake of making it faster and not making it better. I think you are in a unique position as homebrewers that you can probably do those two experiments side by side, and decide which one you like better, or decide the merits of both. I think if you're trying to repitch and harvest yeast, I do think it's detrimental because the later generations of yeast will get used to that kind of scenario and won't want to work at the colder temperatures. Again, morally, I don't think there's anything wrong with it. I don't love it, but I built a brewery in order to make lager. But again, you should, if you like the way your beer tastes, you should do it. And I guess I would just challenge you to do it both ways and see which way you like better. Maybe you can't tell the difference, and maybe it is only a 5% difference, and maybe it makes a difference, maybe it doesn't. But if you're consuming it at home, or I'm trying to sell what I make a certain way, it's all part of like not just the marketing, I guess, of what we do, but it's just kind of part of our whole, and I hate this word, like brand. I don't think there's necessarily anything wrong with it. I do think beer that's taken a little bit more time, when you start to drink 2 and 3 of them, I think you can tell the difference. Maybe not with one by one, but by the time you get to a third one, I think there's a tiresomeness that comes with just that little bit of extra character.
Okay, a couple more questions for Ashleigh before we let her go.
I have a question about, let's see. Oh yeah, what impact does the high altitude? Because you're up around what, Mile High, pretty much, right? So
Yeah, Mile High, baby.
Do you find that to be like a advantage or disadvantage being at the altitude? And what kind of effects do you notice?
Advantage, because when people come from out of town, they get drunk faster. Maybe that's an advantage. I don't know if that, maybe that's a disadvantage. The boiling temperature is definitely a disadvantage. So we have installed some things at my brewery here that allow us to boil slightly under pressure. So we actually boil much closer to 100 degrees C, or 212. However, if you don't have the system we have, people boil much closer to 94. Which is harder to drive off the DMS. That's definitely a disadvantage. Also, trying to dissolve CO2 into the beer can be more difficult. If you're under a bar, so 14.8 PSI, it can be definitely difficult to, like I said, dissolve the amount of CO2 that you need into it. So I have some friends who work in Idaho Springs, which is about at 8,000, almost 9,000 feet. And it is very difficult to carbonate the beer because it's hard to dissolve CO2 at that altitude. Also, their boiling temperature is much, much lower, so they don't get the rate of boil off, which you want to probably see an 8 to 12% boil off rate. And they're seeing more like a 4% boil off rate, which, again, when you're talking about DMS, is a difficulty. The positives, I don't know that there's not a positives, honestly, at the high altitude, except that, you know, it's drier. But like as far as altitude goes, Denver has good water, but nothing to do with altitude is really necessarily better where we are at Mile High.
Okay, we can take one last question. Jennifer, you want to pose this question here?
Actually, that was actually my question as well, and it sounds like it's just, you know, more challenging and not really more productive. So it's interesting.
It's just one more variable. So like, you know, when I think about San Diego, for example, the things that you are challenged with that I'm not is like just the humidity. You know what I mean? Like we don't have a lot of mold here. We just don't. We're so dry that like we don't get a lot of like sweating of our tanks. I don't see a lot of like mold, you know, like things like that. We also don't see like some of the oxidative things that happen, you know, with the just the air and the rain and things like that.
For sure.
So like those are things like it's just one of the things you just kind of have to work around. And we're not very high. There's a brewery here that's like at 12,000 feet, and I honestly don't know how they make beer there.
That's absolutely
like you can't even boil. You can't even boil. Like
yeah, that's crazy.
Firm simmer, you know.
Hey Ashley, if you bring your beer down here, we'll help you carbonate it.
All right, perfect.
I'm going to throw up that there's one more slide right here that just has information here. I don't know if you want to say anything, Ashleigh, on this, but I got to say we really appreciate the fact that you came out and you're presenting to us and showing us a lot of new things about lager brewing that maybe some of us knew, maybe some of us didn't know. So,
yeah, for sure. Yeah, you can find me. You can email me there. Like I said, sometimes I'm not excellent at getting back, but I will eventually get back to you. I'll probably do it at like 3 o'clock in the morning when I can't sleep. But you can follow us on Facebook, Instagram, me personally on Instagram. And then if you literally are ever here in town, I'd love to say hello. You know, we have a pretty good, if you're ever down here, even right now, we have a pretty good socially distanced protocol here. We turned our whole parking lot into a big beer garden with outdoor tables, which is cool. And we follow the rules really, really well. So if you're in the need for a 16-hour drive, here we are.
All right, let's hear a big round of applause for Ashleigh for coming out here and presenting.
Thank you so much.
Awesome. Yeah, awesome presentation.
Yeah.
I appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, we really.
Thank you very much.
If we come out, do we get to pet your dog?
Yeah, you've seen my dog, huh? My dog's up. I have an Irish Great Dane.
Hey, have you thought about planting a hidden 6-pack up on Mount Bierstadt?
I haven't, but I have thought about anybody who hikes Mount Bierstadt with a Bierstadt. I think I'm get a special exclusive thing here. So
Yeah, because which has the picture wall, right?
yeah, it's great.
All right. So Ashleigh, thank you.
Okay, Ashleigh.
Thank you so much.
Wait, I got one more question.
Provide all of these beers for us to be able to sample so that we could enjoy this and enjoy the beers and be able to hear your talk on this. It's been a very great evening, and I encourage all our members to be able to get out and see you when we have better times and we're able to get out to Colorado. So
yeah, feel free to email me, and I will. I'll send you a more finalized. When I'm brewing tomorrow, I'll clean up my presentation a little more. I don't know why my two versions are like interacting with each other, but I'll send you a better presentation. If you also have any questions, like I said, feel free to email me.
No problem. All right. Thank you, Ashleigh.
Yeah, thank you guys. Yeah, I appreciate you.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. A warm
Thank you.
mahalo.
Thank you.
Okay, so
What was your question going to be, Sean?
Well, I just typed it. So I'm on Amazon spending money, and really I need a breathalyzer for my computer. But I just ordered 4 lager yeasts that I've never tried. Well, actually, I tried one of them, S23. But I ordered 4 of them, and the question was, what beer should I make to compare these different yeasts?
Gotta do Helles, I guess, right?
I think that'd be a great choice.
Hey, what'd you guys
Grow up some huge starters and distribute them to all of us, and we'll all brew some.
You know, the nice thing about dry yeast, that's an easy thing to do.
What'd you guys think? I was just totally amazed with
Fantastic.
that. For me,
fantastic beers.
That beer
Great
was
presentation.
amazing.
They're really good. I wish I would have found this beer when I was in Denver a few days ago, because we went to this place and the food was mediocre. It was
now you have
someplace
to go
by
back.
by the ballpark. It was the only place open that had food, so we tried it. The beers were like okay, but not really great.
Now you're gonna have to go back, right? This will give you a reason.
Yeah, well, yeah, my brother-in-law lives there, so we'll have to go back.
Yeah, my brother lives there, so I'm.
Okay.
You know.
My son just moved there and is about to buy a house, so I guess I'll be there a lot.
You should check that house out a little bit before he buys the house. I think you should go out. I'm just saying.
You might need to take a couple trips to check it out.
Yeah, it might take more than one.
He-
to be sure.
He's buying a lot of square footage, so I think we'll be okay.
It sounds like Ryan's advice was to get off the plane and the first place you go is to Bierstadt.
There you go.
That'd be a good
I
idea.
can inspect that house for you.
I
think
have
it
a
was
question
kinda weird how-
to the active, pretty active lager brewers out there. Based on Ashleigh's presentation, is there something that you're going to change in your approach?
I'm going to brew more lagers, Jack. I mean, that's one thing.
I was surprised by some of the things that we kind of always took for granted, like diacetyl rest. She's like, oh yeah, you don't need to do that. You know, it's like, this is a professional talking about how to produce beers, and we're like all stuck in the minutia, and she's looking at the bigger picture, making great beers.
And maybe the beers are great. Maybe part of it is that, if like you're doing if you have like an under pitch and you're not doing everything exactly by the book, maybe a diacetyl rest is a good thing. But you can see from these beers that she's brewing right there, and she's not doing any of that there, that they're great beers coming out of this lager program that she's got going. So, maybe it depends on what you're actually doing.
Yeah, it sounds like if you ferment cool enough, like from the get-go, I mean, I guess this means that, Derek, you can't be doing any more of those 10-day lagers or whatever. But,
well, you can.
I knew somebody was going to ask it, but
she said it herself. It depends on what you like and what you're doing. But she's doing almost entirely decoction mashes, and so. And I know I've done a number of decoction mashes, but I haven't done one in a very long time. And for me, this has been kind of inspiring to, especially that Helles. That when I'm looking at that and going, oh my God, for me that was a 5-star beer. I just love that beer.
I feel like this seems like more simple than what I thought a lager brew should be. So it makes me inspired as well that I can do this without a ridiculous amount of time and effort.
One thing I wanted to ask her about, I was wondering what, I know she's doing the double concoction, but, what takes 28 hours for that? Because I was under the impression that a lot of times professional brewers can brew about in the same amount of time as a home brewer, if not even sometimes quicker. And then for lagers, would it take a home brewer 28 hours to do a double decoction mash?
She said she was doing 3 back-to-back brews.
Oh, 3 batches. Okay, it's 3 batches. Sorry.
Because and you could do
It's like a 9-hour batch.
I don't know if you've ever done a double brew, but the advantage of doing a double brew is that the cleanup is only one time. For you make 2 batches, but your cleanup is only once, and so. If she's doing a triple batch, it's the same thing. They do 3 batches, and then at the end of that, they're doing all the cleanup. And so, divide it by 3. The amount of work you have to do for cleanup.
Super efficient.
Yeah, but Andy, if you remember, you, Todd, and myself discovered that 2.5 batches, we start making mistakes.
That's why I asked her about the sleeping time, because she's got a partner, and I asked her about they're trading shifts to sleep and all that kind of stuff. And it sounds like they are doing that stuff. But you're exactly right. If you stay up too long brewing, you end up getting a BUI. I don't know if you guys know what a BUI is. That's brewing under the influence. Like you'll end up you're brewing and you're going, everything's going great, and then you grab your first beer, and then things start going the other direction. So
never drink until you're at the chilling stage.
Yeah, you got it.
That's my rule.
Yeah,
would never brew.
I can't wait that long. Once my boil is going, then I'm going myself. I can't wait that long.
Well, that's okay. But
that's
Judy's
when I eat lunch.
Our homebrew recipes used to be first step, pour first beer. It's like, no, we've stopped doing that. We have stopped doing that.
Oh, I love doing that because
you're not young anymore, Lauren.
No, we're not.
When me and Jim were brewing a lambic back, I don't know, it was a couple of years ago. Andy was brewing in his garage. He had his whole system set up there, and me and Jim had our mobile systems out in the yard, and it started raining. And so, we kind of I'm trying to do a little something and then go under the awning, and then Andy would stick his head out from the garage and say, "It doesn't look so bad right now." Yeah, sure, it doesn't look bad to you. You're in the garage.
I'm like, it's not raining in here. It's not raining in here. I don't know what you're complaining about.
It was raining cats and dogs. We actually made a scabby cat sour.
Yeah, you guys are troopers. I mean, that you're talking about that Lambic brew session where actually we got some showers on that day. I remember that.
So Derek, do you have any comments after Ashleigh's extended fermentation schedule?
Yeah, I mean, it makes good beer, obviously.
Well, and like she said, it kind of comes down to it could be experiment, right? As to spending 40 days versus 10 days. I mean, just to throw out a couple numbers. But what's the difference, and is the 40 days worth it?
Right.
How does 28 hours of continuous brewing affect beer quality?
I mean, I think a lot of it comes down to is is the beer 100% better, 50% better, 10% better, 5% better, 2% better? You know, like
and like she said, do you enjoy it? Is it good enough? Do you like it? Right.
Well, yours may be different too because she's doing it on a big batch professional level with large yeast pitch and things like that. So yours may be different. So you may have to do something different to get that good quality out of yours.
I think there's something to be said too if you're trying to repitch your yeast, or if you're always like, for a home brewer, it's not a lot for us necessarily. Probably a lot of people may just be buying new yeast all the time anyway. It seemed like one of the bigger things was the repitching of the yeast and like it not working as hard on future generations. And if we're not worried about that also, like you said, if it's only 2% better, 5% better to do it, the more extended way. But you're seeing more of the repitching of yeast, then I can see that.
Yeah, Chris, what I got out of that was yeast has feelings too. So so look, what she was saying was like, look, if you let your yeast go up on a diacetyl rest and then you're going to repitch that yeast, then maybe it's going to be, you've got the hippie yeast that's decided that it can only work at high temperatures, and she's kind of training her yeast to go for multiple generations. And
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so it may not, if you're not doing that, it may not be applicable, but if you're reusing your yeast, and maybe for like a lager where it's so hard to grow the yeast, it might be a good idea to reuse your yeast and make a few of them. You need big pitch rates for it. So I think there might be something there to what she was saying for homebrewers.
I've always been afraid to repitch these because I feel like I don't know what it's going to do the second time around, and I never want to really wild card.
I've had the opposite experience. I mean, usually my second pitch is better than my first one because I've got so much yeast there. As long as the yeast has been in good form, I get a really strong fermentation and it ferments out real well, and so I always feel really good about repitching the yeast. I don't know, for how many generations you think you can do that for. I've done, 3. I'm usually 2.
Andy, how quickly, once you harvest from a batch and you repitch, how long does that take? What's your time frame? I heard you should do it within 7 days, 10 days. I don't know, no longer than 2 weeks.
I think White Labs was saying that the viability after 1 month was 50% of what it was. That's like after 1 month. But I've always just done them right away. And what that forces you to do though is you're like brewing back-to-back brewing. You're brewing, your brew session is done. You're going to, oh, my yeast is healthy, I need to brew again, and then you brew again. And then maybe you even do it a third time, and then you're just like, I'm tired. I can't keep doing this. And you stop. And so you get 3 generations out of it in 3 weeks or 4 weeks or 5 weeks, or maybe even 6 weeks, but it's like between 1 and 2 weeks for me is what I think. You've got this fresh yeast and it's really in good shape.
So do you make a big starter and split it, or do you like take the yeast from one complete fermentation and then just repitch it?
I take the yeast from usually I take the yeast from, what I do is I usually take the yeast from a complete fermentation and that gets repitched, and it can be done in 1 of 2 ways. You can either pitch right onto the yeast cake, or you can basically take it out and, then pitch it into what you're doing. And
so you have a glass carboy with yeast at the bottom, you pour it out, you rack it into a secondary whatever, and then you just pour new wort right on top of that cake?
Oh yeah.
Exactly. Do it that way, yeah.
Okay.
I think it also, so it kind of depends, because I feel like it kind of depends sometimes what you're brewing. Like, I feel like, I don't know, because I usually do that more for high ABV beers. Like if I'm brewing a big stout, I'll brew like a porter, knowing like the next week I'm going to transfer right on top of that yeast cake and it works great.
Okay.
I've gone like 6 weeks between and it worked fine and got it.
Yeah, I do. So I'll go like between 6, I'll go longer like with my wild beers. you know, I'll have stuff, you know, potentially for months, you know what I mean, and I'll repitch that even as a primary. But I have one thing I've been concerned with is with like IPAs. If you dry hop a lot, like especially if you're doing like dry high Krausen, I've heard it's not good to like reuse the yeast from like if you've done, you know, if you got a bunch of like hop troop in there.
Yeah, and that's what I do. And then I have a bunch of crap on the top that's stuck at the, you know, from the Krause, and I have all this shit from the Krause.